They should have called this documentary series Ruthless Aggravation instead of Ruthless Aggression on the WWE Network. And I'm not going to knock all of it. I'm going to knock a little bit of it, but I'm not going to knock all it because it was easy to watch and it's a company documentary. So, yes, what are they going to say in some instances? But there was just a few things that I was like, oh my God. You challenged me I just watched the first episode. You challenged me I'm going to watch this all the way through eventually because especially since I'm on it somewhere, unless they fucking got mad at what I said and cut me out. By the time it's over with, I'll have been on it. So I'm going to watch the whole series, but the first one, it just, they do a great job. The folks at the studio, the editors and the producers and the people that put together the footage and etc. So I can't fault their programs because they're so professional. They're the best looking ones, but at the same time, you have to know what actually happened on any given incident that they do a documentary about instead of learning from their documentaries. You know what I'm saying? You already have to know, and then you watch theirs because it's got the cool footage and shit and nice comments, but you already have to know because you can't just take their word for it. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. That's the story of WWE, is you see one of their documentaries, and it's some bullshit history that never actually happened. There are elements of the truth mixed in with the McMahon rewriting of history.
Yes, and they're good. They're good glossers because they gloss over things. But the season 1 or episode 1 started out with the recap of the Monday Night Wars, and I think we can probably all agree now in hindsight that what I said in 1998 has come to pass. The Attitude Era, the Monday Night Wars, not just one company, but the whole thing, where they just tried to fucking just put each other out of business weekly for 2 years and hot-shotted everything, was the worst thing to ever happen to the fucking wrestling business in retrospect. Because not only because they've never come close to that fucking level of popularity, but also because they just burnt through every fucking thing. Not only every personality, but every angle, everything that could be done to the human body, every kind of goofy shit. They, exposed whatever they wanted to expose. Then they tried to make people believe other shit was real. They came up with work shoot angles. They went through everything we could have done for fucking 40 years in 2 years. And finally, but in their term, the Attitude Era beats WCW with considerable help, not mentioned from all of the WCW executives that botched the whole thing up and then the merger. But they, I saw Brian Gerwitz for the first time. I don't think I ever met him. I didn't even remember him if he ever came down here to Louisville, and they didn't come often, the writers. But the bug-eyed frog-looking fuck that had the fight with Paul Lee, or the argument with Paul Lee at the office in Stamford. Do you remember hearing this story?
Vaguely. What was that? That was when Paul Lee had his blow up with Stephanie?
Well, I which one, I don't know. But no, the story went out, whatever the timing was. It wasn't long. It was the beginning of the end, maybe. But the story went out that Paul Lee and this Brian Gerwitz, and because I guess he's the comedy writer. He was all about comedy. Now he's the guy that works for The Rock and his movie company. And he was just, he was one of these writers that came into the fucking wrestling business somehow and spent a while there. And The Rock liked him because he had good, funny lines. So that's, whatever. But if you think me and Shitstain would be exact opposites, I can imagine Paul Lee, with his background in the business and the way he liked to do things and the way that he probably was the smartest guy at what they needed to do at that time in the fucking room. And he's got to put up with this fucking bug-eyed fucking frog-looking fuck that even he thinks he can whip. And they ended up in some type of screaming fucking yelling match in the offices after some type of meeting in Stamford. And I think that Paulie may have got reprimanded or sent home for a period of time, something of that. And I think, they probably yelled at Gerwitz too, but not very loud, or he would probably have fainted. But at the time I hear this and I go, I don't know what this fucking guy looks like, but I would love to have seen Paulie going all Bill Watts on somebody. And it turns out it's this fucking guy. He looks like a frog.
You get so much heat, and in some cases, rightly so, for screaming matches that you've had with people. Paulie, kind of under the radar. How many screaming matches has he had throughout the
good
years?
Lord.
Him and Flair, right?
Yeah, him and Flair, if you believe him from his own chicken lips, him and Vern Gagne, although I don't believe that he said any of the things to Vern Gagne's face that he told a lot of people he said to Vern Gagne. He ran ECW. He may have screamed in different directions or at different, folks or whatever, but I was screaming in Smoky Mountain and he was, I'm sure, doing a lot of screaming. Not when he was trying to get people to do what he wanted them to do. That's when he's smooth. But in panic situations and riots, of which they had more of them than we did, Paulie's a volatile individual also. Bombastic personality, as they say.
And, of course, him and Stephanie. That's the famous one.
Him and Stephanie. Him and Hurd a few times. Just that I can think of that I was around. But anyway, so they paint they had painted the picture. The Monday Night Wars were over with. What do they do next? And then now in hindsight, it's even crazier. They tried the Shane-owned WCW. I remember that at the time. I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ. Because they thought, well, this will be great, the McMahon family rivalry. No, it just made it bullshit because nobody believed. They knew that somehow Vince McMahon had won out and bought the company. But then to turn around and make it a work instantly, I still say they could have done something with Bischoff or something to where that the company, that WCW remained some type of entity or at least a renegade part of the corporate structure or whatever. But just all the McMahons own everything and they're fighting amongst themselves just made it too WWF-ish, as well as they didn't bring all the top guys because the Turner Home Entertainment contracts were ridiculous. Well, yeah, the Turner Home contracts will pay you to sit at home. For the people who don't understand, the really top stars of WCW, in order to make WCW look even better than it, I don't know if WCW, how much money they made those couple of years they were really hot, but they didn't make the money back that they lost over the period of the venture. And to make WCW look better in leaner times, in unhappier days, they had made the big money contracts with the top guys, the Nash and Hall $1 million or whatever, and the Sting big contract, and all the Goldberg, all the guys that were getting paid huge money were paid by Turner Home Entertainment instead of WCW itself. It was all coming from the Turner umbrella, but it was on different books. So when WCW was sold to Vince McMahon, tell me, Brian Last, if I'm delaying this information to the folks properly, when WCW was sold to Vince McMahon for a fire sale price, he got the opportunity to absorb all the WCW wrestler contracts, but the guys that had contracts with Turner Home Entertainment, the biggest stars, would still get paid for the next year and a half to just stay fucking home because the Turner Home Entertainment didn't fold.
Yeah, they got paid until their contracts came up, which is why Hogan, Nash, Hall, Sting,
Flair, I think.
Flair, really everyone. It's really every single top guy.
Except Page and Booker T. Page, I think, asked out of his deal so he could take a WWE deal because he always wanted to be a star and he hadn't had enough of it yet.
And that was a mistake. Point.
Well, but at least he tried. Well, I know, but at least he tried. But anyway, but I've said before, they should have bit the bullet. They should have gone to those guys. They should have said, look, this is going to upset our fucking salary structure. And we want you to know that we're not going to renew for this automatically in a year and a half or 2 years or whatever the fuck, but we'll pay you to the end of this thing because we need to do the invasion angle right, or they shouldn't have done it at all, which is what they didn't do it right, and they shouldn't have done it at all. But they said that they couldn't get the top stars because the contracts were too expensive. It just, they wouldn't spend the money because they didn't want to upset the salary structure in their own company and piss off all their guys, where the new guys in the company we beat are making twice as much or 3 times as much or whatever money as we are. But they should have made allowances for the fact that those guys were integral to the success of the whole thing. That core of guys, 5 or 6 of them at least, didn't have to get every single one. And they should have bit the fucking bullet and done it right. And Bruce Pritchard, who, if Vince has changed, because I heard Vince's words, I even heard Vince's voice, but it was coming out of Bruce's face. Anytime they needed to go to something that was the company explanation for something, there was Bruce to nail exactly what Vince would have said.
He was completely unbearable on this thing, and he's so full of shit. And that's the one thing that everyone should know when you watch this, that Bruce Pritchard is full of shit, and you really can't believe anything he says because it's this fucking Baghdad Bob line of propaganda. But let me ask you, when it comes to
wait a minute, I was not going to just savage young Mr. Pritchard like you just did.
Did I say anything that wasn't true?
I wasn't going to savage. But here's the thing. Where they got to, well, Bruce said what they got was the WCW green underneath guys is what they got. And what Bruce said, well, the WWF audience just didn't know who these guys were. They did. They knew who they were. They just didn't care because it was the underneath guys and not the guys that they wanted to fucking see in the WWF fighting the WWF's top stars. That was what the problem was from the start. And Bruce has bought the WWE audience that Kevin Dunn used to fucking say, well, our audience doesn't watch any other wrestling. Well, some of them maybe, but the people that fucking make the most effort to watch all the shows and go to the live events, the TVs or whatever, do. But also they glossed over the fact that poor, who was it? Goddamn, Booker and Bagwell were booed out of the building in Tacoma, Washington. Had WCW ever been to Tacoma, fucking Washington?
Maybe, but it certainly wasn't. You know, if it was in the South, it would have been a completely different reaction.
Well, but also Bagwell was in it now too. But still, Booker would have. Booker was over. But if they were going for a WCW, a launch of something to do with WCW, and this was going to be their fucking first stab at it, people wanted to see fucking Ric Flair or Sting or even Hall and Nash come back at that point, or somebody that's identified in a major way with WCW. They didn't want to see a TV match with Booker T and fucking Buff Bagwell. So the people hooted at it in Washington State, and they cut the whole thing off because Vince didn't ever want to. That's why the whole thing failed. Vince didn't ever want to present WCW as comparable or competition to or equal to. It was always that Southern group, that renegade group, whatever the fuck. So that's kind of where they botched that.
When it comes to the contracts, and obviously those were pretty gigantic contracts, especially for that time, a lot of those top guys had, and I think some of them had a favorite nations clause, so that no matter what someone else got, they, like Kevin Nash, I think, they would get boosted up. But
well, yeah, and you know what? But here's the thing: Nash was probably the guy they needed the least because he's the guy that the WWF audience had already seen the most anyway. They needed Goldberg and Flair and Sting, and then it would have worked because those were guys completely identified with WCW or the NWA that had never been in the other company before.
If the WWE had brought some of those guys in and guys in the locker room had problems with it, would it have been guys like JBL and Bob Holly, or would it have been top guys like Undertaker and Steve Austin? Or would they have realized, you know what, we're going to make more money by bringing these guys in and doing an invasion properly? I mean, who would have had a big problem with it? The mid-card guys in the locker room or the top guys?
The mid-card guys wouldn't have had they already had a problem with what the top guys were making anyway. It doesn't matter if you're top guys, the mid-card guys don't like what you make. Certain top guys in the locker room would have known that it was good for business and wouldn't have mind. I don't think Austin would have had a problem if it was brought in, and obviously he would have been figured heavily instead of being switched heel, which was another big mistake that they made right at the exactly same time, some of those top guys would have known, yes, this is going to be big money, but also they would have known if we can get, it was more, Vince didn't want to upset the salary structure. Vince didn't want all of his guys asking for raises next time their contracts were up next time around. If they'd have done mega business for a year off an invasion, then all of the WWF guys that were coming up for renewal would have just been coming out of a fucking record year and wanting more money. So it was more, Vince didn't want to upset his salary structure from his side of the goddamn fence than the heat in the locker room.
He had no competition. They had nothing to negotiate against.
But you got some, the guys that got over to the level of Steve Austin and The Rock and those guys always had something to negotiate against, which was going fucking home, which is what Austin eventually did.
Yeah, no, they did. The top guys did. But but whenever you hear these things, it's always like the mid-card guys in the locker room, like, we were in a fight for our lives. No, you weren't. You didn't matter on the totem pole. I mean, with all due respect, the JBLs didn't matter in this whole thing.
But, and that's, and we'll get to that later on also. We talk about the Brawl for All, but the OVW section where they, blitz through Cena, Orton, Batista, etc. They mentioned that, here these guys were trying to train these new generation great athletes, but they're green. And then they flash forward to a year and a half later when the WCW top guys finally come in. And instantly you see Flair in the fucking ring and you go, well, this is what it could have been all along, you dumb shits. Because if they'd had Flair in the fucking ring instead of to wrestle or talk instead of Bagwell and Booker, it would have been a whole different thing.
You know what? Say what you want about Bischoff, but Bischoff was really good on air as a performer for WWE.
Oh, yeah.
Like even bringing him in with that initial crew, even though it was mostly the undercard and midcard guys and, Booker T, Dallas Page, Bagwell, but they got rid of him pretty quickly. Having even Bischoff there would have been a major help. I know he wouldn't have done it at that time. He was probably pretty bitter. He had just tried to buy the company and thought he had it. But it was no one. It was no one who was on top of that TV show that was brought.
But Bischoff is smart enough. If they had got all the top guys, Bischoff would have come too because he'd have known this will be the biggest thing ever done. But they didn't, so he didn't. And, they could have made it believable. Bischoff is a great TV performer. What a smarmy ass fucking heel. Like many of us, plays to type. But anyway, so it could have been, but it wasn't. So it didn't materialize. And then they show all the edgy bullshit, and they called it edgy instead of bullshit, but at least acknowledged that it was rotten. All the stupid things they did for a couple years there when they first started getting the TV writers involved. And then Bruce tried to happy talk the brand split. And I thought, all the guys here, the guys were not only talking smart, but there's guys talking about being worried about their spots. Stars don't worry about their spots. You think Betty Davis worried about what fucking movie the studio was going to call and tell her that she needed to do once she became a star and could tell Jack Warner to go fuck himself? Stars do not worry about their spots, just like the other day when the announcer said that Rhea Ripley had struggled with self-doubt. Stars don't fucking doubt themselves. So anyway, the guys just, they want the guys talking about like, oh, we were so happy to be, to be chosen. Rocky Goes to Hollywood. That was a group, wasn't it?
Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Oh, yeah, it was Frankie.
Relax
Rocky
with Frankie.
Yeah. Relax. Don't do it. Rocky Goes to Hollywood. Austin leaves. At least, here's the thing about this whole. And of course, this is so much inside baseball and exposing the business anyway and how all this is done. I didn't like it from that respect, even though it's a good professional television show to watch with a lot of information, a lot of misinformation. But out of the whole thing, the one thing that made the wrestling business look good was at least it made Steve Austin look like a renegade who wouldn't do what he was told and just said, fuck it. I ain't goddamn throwing the fight. I'm not taking a dive for this fucking guy. Fuck you. So And yes, when you think of that, they legitimately, that somebody's mouth spoke the words, let's have Brock Lesnar versus Steve Austin on free TV with no buildup. Of course, Bruce defended it. But, that's the mind boggles to begin with of why that would be done. And of course, Steve would say, fuck you. Ernie Ladd would have said, fuck you. Ernie Ladd would have walked out on live TV, walked around the ring, and then walked out the front door just to really piss him off. But I hated hearing them discussing or talking about telling Steve Austin to lose, because even if he refused this time, by extension of logic, that means that many other times he didn't, because he blew up and he left about this one, but he lost matches before. Was everything he did, was it all just a lie, Steve? Was it a lie? Because they believed in Steve Austin. And the reason why the business fell in a hole in spring of 2001 was not just because WCW went out of business. It was because they turned Steve Austin heel and he hugged Vince McMahon at the climax of WrestleMania in Houston when I was watching the monitor backstage, and got up and said, well, there's the end of that fucking ride, and fucking walked out because I knew what they'd done. They made Austin one of the boys, the one guy the people believed in. They didn't even believe in Rock. They just liked to watch Rock, but they didn't believe in him. They knew he was fucking putting them on. The Rock and the way he talked and everything. But Austin, the hottest that anybody has ever been for a period of time was Austin, because they believed in him alone in this screwy business more than anybody else in the modern era. So when he hugged Vince, that took the fucking wind out of the WWF audience sales at a time when WCW's audience said, well, fuck it, our last link to Southern wrestling is gone, so we'll leave. But so I hated the part about that, because even now, Austin's mystique grows. He still gets the biggest pop when he comes out. But then they were talking about him always being one of the boys, because they were talking about telling him to lose and what creative had for him. So, I loved the real drama of Vince McMahon versus Steve Austin, but I hate the fucking reveal, because Steve Austin still has a mystique with some people that would buy him as legitimate before anything else in this business. What do you think? Am I just, at this point, they're teleporting? Does any of this matter?
No, I think doesn't matter. It's all gone. And, I think that's such an interesting part of it, because we're talking about how Vince was worried about how the top guys would react if he brought in those big contracts from WCW. Steve Austin was the top guy of all time. He's the guy. I mean, they had Bruno and Hogan and Rock and all these guys, Cena. Steve Austin's the reason they were able to go public.
Yeah.
Steve Austin turned that from a, multi-million-dollar business to a multi-million-dollar business. You can go look at the financials. Steve Austin is the guy they transformed the company behind. And at the end of the day, they treated him like a jerk-off. And he went home and he was right. They wanted him to lose to Brock Lesnar with no build-up in a King of the Ring qualifying match.
On free TV.
On TV. And, the thing that disturbs me, and I think this happens too often with guys, is that they do something dumb, and you'll see this in, I think, episode 2 when you get to it. WWE does something dumb, the star reacts to it, and then later on they end up saying, well, I was wrong, I handled it wrong.
Yeah. I was immature.
Steve Austin went home and
I should have put the pumpkin on my head. I'm sorry.
They were disrespectful to Steve Austin. He reacted appropriately and he went home. They should have expected that. But instead they went on TV and they buried him. Vince went on TV and buried him. And Steve Austin was in the right, and here's Steve Austin now and he's like, well, I should have done it differently. You shouldn't have. They should have done it differently. And then you'll see it in part 2 with Cena, where he's talking about why he didn't get over right away, and he's like, I failed. No, they took the guy that was the star as the prototype and didn't know what to do with him, and then squandered it. Luckily, you recovered and became one of the big stars in their history, but there's too much of that, letting them off the hook and taking all the blame on yourself from the top guys, I think.
Well, with Austin, he did the right thing, but he did it too soon. So there is some culpability in that. He was just, I recall hearing the whole story. I think I talked to him about it one time. It may have been on the air, may have been not, so I won't quote too many details. But he was expecting something screw when he got there, and he was in kind of a fucking mood because he knew they were going to try to give him some bullshit. And they gave him the bullshit. He could have gone into Vince McMahon's office and just said, I'm Stone Cold Steve Austin. I'm the biggest fucking star money generator you've ever had. I absolutely refuse to do this bullshit, but I'll be on your fucking TV show tonight, Vince. So let's come up with something that I will fucking do. And he could have sat there until Vince did it, but instead he just, you know what the fuck you. And then Vince was crazy for burying him at that time because he should have known that it wouldn't last long. Because how could Steve Austin be, not be part of their legacy or whatever. Anyway, speaking of legacy, they acted like they changed WWF to WWE on purpose. Never mentioned the World Wildlife Fund. Just, we're going to change the image and blah, 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 and to get the F out campaign and everything, which I will give them credit. I like to get the F out. That was kind of cute.
I agree.
If you had to do it.
Good campaign.
But I hated, as soon as I heard it, you can imagine, I hated the word entertainment in that. And if anybody will notice also in all the time that I did OVW television, where I talked about the WWF and later the WWE, all the time that I've ever appeared on any television for anybody or any talking head gimmicks for the WWE since then, I've never said the word entertainment. I never say the company name out loud. I said WWE, but I would never say World Wrestling Entertainment. I'm not on tape in any way, except right now, telling this story, saying that. Anyway, but did you notice, because I'm looking at my notes here, from the highlights, the in-ring highlights they did, 2002, 2003 era, there's more stars. There's more excitement in the crowd. There's a better level of work in the ring with guys that look different but like something. It was still the guys from the territories or that had high-level training and a lot of experience working in a variety of places. Even the OVW guys obviously looked like $1 million, but they held their own in that environment, but you still had the Edges and the Christians and the Eddie Guerreros and the whole 9 yards. And when you saw Vince challenging the guys to have the ruthless aggression, there was a lot of fucking talent around that ring. And the in-ring stuff, it seemed the highlights more gritty, realistic, instead of today's boom, everybody's working the same, looking the same, doing the same kind of shit for the most part. You can see the difference.
Yeah. That show had a pulse back then.
Thank you once again for that fucking incisive and biting retort to my comment.
No, that show had a pulse back then. You could see it in those clips. Now it's just the crowd doesn't give a shit. The wrestlers, they're wrestling the WWE style, which is more defined now than ever before. They're coming out of that performance center with nothing but WWE style. I mean, it's a tale of two cities.